A moment ago, they had no idea who I was. Their eyes scanned me, moving from my polished black shoes up to the skin they believed didn't belong. One smug gesture, a cold smile, and with scripted politeness, they asked me to leave. I didn't argue. I didn't explain who I truly was. Why should I? The real show was yet to come. Soon enough, they would realize that this hotel, which they guarded so carefully against me, now belonged to me. Standing at the entrance of this luxurious hotel, I couldn't help but feel the absurdity of it all. My suit fit perfectly, my shoes gleamed like mirrors, and in my pocket was the key to a world I had already conquered: wealth, success, recognition. Yet, despite all of that, there stood a barrier before me, not one made of stone or glass, but one built from human prejudice, from a narrow perspective that couldn't see beyond the color of my skin. I could feel their eyes on me, appraising and judging, and in the end, labeling me. To them, I was just a black man who clearly didn't belong, an anomaly in their world. This place was meant to exude prestige, comfort, and hospitality, but the air was thick with tension. The staff began to eye me like a potential threat. In that moment, when you feel like an outsider in someone else's world, it's not about how much money you have. It's about how long you can withstand before something changes. I wasn't angry, though. What struck me more was how quickly they judged me based on my appearance, without ever considering who I truly was. The money I had earned could open any door, but I had learned that money could only buy what hadn't been tainted by human prejudice. I didn't need to prove my worth to these people. My story was only beginning. With every step I took on the marble floor, it felt like a challenge. The spacious lobby, with its golden chandeliers, luxurious furniture, and flawless design, was meant to inspire awe. But all I felt was a chill, not from the air conditioning, but from the people who filled the space. Here, luxury and arrogance went hand in hand. My goal was simple: check in like any other guest. But as I walked toward the reception desk, I noticed the hotel staff exchanging knowing glances. I approached the desk where the manager, a blond man with a rehearsed smile, stood. Without even looking up, he knew what he was going to say. When he finally did glance at me, his gaze spoke louder than any words. He scanned me, taking in how perfectly I was dressed and how little it seemed to matter to him. "I'm sorry, but we have no available rooms for you," he said, his politeness barely masking the indifference. What surprised me wasn't the rejection itself, but the certainty in his voice. He spoke as though the decision wasn't even his to make, as if some larger system, one that had taught him to judge by appearances, was directing his every move. In this world, luxury and arrogance were inseparable, and his words felt like the closing act of a play that I had only just begun. I could have told him my name, and the situation would have shifted instantly. They would have rushed to apologize, offered me the best suite, showered me with compliments. But I chose not to break their little performance. I wanted to see how far they were willing to go. As I stood by the desk, a security guard, a large man with a shaved head, approached. His face remained neutral, but his politeness was tinged with forcefulness. He moved toward me with the same practiced detachment, and I could feel the tension in the air intensify. The security guard's insistence made it clear there was no room for negotiation. "Please leave the hotel," he said, his voice polite yet firm, leaving no space for argument. I stared at him, silent, in that moment having no desire to engage or justify myself. Their ignorance and arrogance had become a lesson I'd remember, but it didn't deserve an explanation. Without a word, I turned and made my way toward the exit. Each step on the marble floor echoed, a reminder of something inevitable yet to come. I knew they had no idea how close they were to seeing their world unravel. They only saw what they wanted to see in me, but everything was about to change. After a few paces, I stopped and glanced back. This hotel would soon be mine, and then they would understand how easily illusions can be shattered. Weeks passed. Since that day I walked away without a word, but certainly not without a plan. During that time, a clear strategy took shape in my mind, not just to reclaim my dignity, but to take control of their world. The irony of life was that I'd always been a step ahead of those who judged by appearances. Now, standing in front of the same building, I was no longer just a guest. I was the new owner. As I made my way to the lawyer's office to sign the purchase documents, I felt a mix of emotions. It wasn't anger. I had long since learned not to waste energy on that, but anticipation. This was the moment when insults became strength, and humiliation turned into an opportunity for power. I wasn't seeking petty revenge or childish pranks. No, my goal was more complex, to make them dismantle their own illusions. Their pride would be their undoing. Sitting in the lawyer's office, I couldn't help but smile as I looked at the papers confirming my ownership. The hotel was mine now, and this was just the first step. After signing the documents, I went straight to the hotel with a new objective: to begin my observations. The staff continued their work, unaware that their world was about to change. To them, I remained invisible. My name hadn't been mentioned in the boardroom yet, so I had the freedom to watch them in their natural element. The meeting with the hotel's general manager went as expected, formal and filled with a hint of arrogance. He probably believed he was in control. "Our staff is stable and professional," he said, a trace of pride in his voice. "We haven't had to let anyone go in a long time, and our turnover rate is minimal." I nodded, keeping my expression calm, but inside I was certain their world was on the verge of collapse, and they didn't even know it. I studied them carefully. The same blonde manager who'd denied me a room, the security guard who had thrown me out, all of them blissfully unaware of the peril that was silently growing beneath them. As I walked down the stairs after the meeting, I paused. Should I act immediately, exposing them and firing them all in one fell swoop? Or should I let them continue to live in their delusion for a little longer, savoring their false sense of stability? My plan hinged on one thing: patience. The day I decided to begin my little show came unexpectedly. I was walking down the corridor, casually glancing around the lobby, when I spotted him. The manager, the same blonde one. He was engrossed in his work, occasionally glancing up from his papers. He was reviewing something in the logbook, completely unaware of my presence. I stood only a few feet away, but this time I wasn't invisible. I was the owner of the building, though only I knew it. His face remained relaxed, completely oblivious to the fact that the fate of his job was already in my hands. For a moment, I considered how easy it would be to change everything in an instant. One word, and he would lose his job. His confidence and comfortable life would come crashing down. But where was the satisfaction in that? I didn't want to act out of spite. My enjoyment lay in watching them dig their own graves and witnessing how their actions would lead to their own downfall. I wanted them to understand their mistake. This wasn't revenge, it was justice. Smiling quietly, I turned and continued walking, aware that much more important steps lay ahead of me. Today I was entering the same hotel, but it wasn't the same day. I had walked out of it feeling humiliated, but now I returned with complete power. Everything had changed. This hotel, which had once rejected me, was now mine, and I was ready to take control. They didn't even know they had lost. From the moment I stepped in, I could feel the tension. Maybe it was all in my head, but knowing I was about to confront the people who had looked down on me just weeks ago filled me with energy. I remained calm and collected on the outside, but inside, my resolve was boiling. The only question was how they would react when they realized their world had shifted beneath them. Before stepping into the conference room, I paused. I took a deep breath and allowed myself a brief smile. I wasn't going to warn them, no prior notice to prepare. That was the point. I wanted them to feel the chaos, as if the ground were slipping from under them. When I entered the conference room, everyone was already seated, and they didn't notice me at first. I took a seat in the corner where I could observe without drawing attention. The manager, the same one who had denied me a room, stood by the board speaking with his usual confidence. He laid out the day's tasks for the staff, still carrying the arrogance that had defined his judgment of my unsuitable status. I watched him quietly, knowing that he had no idea his world had just come crashing down. The moment our eyes met, his expression changed. It was brief, just a second, but I saw recognition flicker in his eyes. He froze, his words cut off mid-sentence. First, his face drained of color, then he quickly masked his surprise with professionalism. "Who are you?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. His voice was steady, but cold. The entire room fell silent, all eyes now focused on the silent confrontation between us. "I'm your new owner," I replied calmly with a slight smile. The room fell into an even heavier silence, my words hanging in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. His face went through a rapid change, disbelief, shock, and then fear. This was the pivotal moment. No one in the room moved or spoke. It felt like the air itself had stilled. Zrenie ожидая неизбежного. The employee's eyes shifted between me and the manager, the silence thickening. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm, when you know something monumental is about to happen, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. The manager tried to speak, but his words caught in his throat. His breathing quickened, and his face grew even paler. His eyes darted nervously around the room, as if searching for a way out. I could see the carefully constructed world he had built start to crumble in his mind. All the illusions he had built over the years, his status, his influence, the comfort of his position, were falling apart. He couldn't believe that the man he had once looked down on was now his boss. That with a single phrase, I had destroyed everything he had once thought was his strength. This was the beginning of the end for him. He was just another subordinate now, and the most ironic part was that he was now answering to the very person he had once dismissed. I stood up and walked toward the exit, leaving the entire room in stunned silence, still processing what had just unfolded. But this was only the beginning. I was ready to reshape this hotel beyond recognition. I was prepared to rebuild it from the inside out, not just the physical structure, but its very essence. When I claimed ownership, no one knew what to expect next. They might have anticipated immediate firings, staff reshuffles, or drastic changes, but I wasn't interested in following the usual script. I was fascinated by what lies beneath people's facades, how they react when everything they take for granted starts to fall apart. With each passing day, I became more aware of the depth of my power. I could shatter their confidence and expose their illusions at any time. But I chose a different path. It wasn't enough to simply strip away their masks. I wanted them to peel them off themselves, to watch as their world crumbled and feel the full weight of their own prejudices. One morning, as I prepared for the day, a wave of quiet satisfaction washed over me. Now, I could stand back and watch as they revealed their true selves under the pressure of this new reality. The first change I made was to adjust the work schedule. Staff were assigned tasks they once considered beneath their elevated roles. I made them interact with lower-level employees as equals. This was my test to see how their arrogance would erode over time. A few weeks passed, and each day felt like a move in a game of chess, with my pieces in perfect position, waiting for the right moment to strike. I studied them closely, observing their reactions, watching as their arrogance slowly gave way to insecurity. The manager, once so confident, began to lose control. His pride was chipped away as he was forced to negotiate with junior staff or oversee tasks he had previously deemed beneath him. His face tightened every day, and I could see the helplessness creeping in, though he still tried to maintain his hold on power. The other employees also began to crumble under the pressure. Their inflated sense of self-importance melted away like ice in the sun. They were lost, and that's where my satisfaction lay. Conversations became short, and smiles disappeared. I wasn't just the owner now. I had become the invisible hand, manipulating their inner fears and vulnerabilities. One day, during a routine walk through the hotel, I ran into the manager in the lobby. He looked drained, his gaze uncertain, but he stepped forward and said, "We need to talk." His voice trembled, despite his best efforts to keep it steady. He wanted to talk about his role, about the importance of his work. I allowed myself a small smile and stopped in front of him. This was the moment I had been waiting for. As he spoke about his crucial role in the hotel's success, I realized the time had come. He was still clinging to the illusion of his significance, but his confidence was slipping away with every word. I didn't interrupt him, letting him voice his desperate attempts to maintain control. His arguments sounded hollow, each one weaker than the last. I knew he was only focused on one thing: how to preserve his place beneath me. When he finished, I smiled, not mockingly but calmly, with a quiet power. "I remember you," I said, looking him squarely in the eye. "I remember the day you kicked me out of here. Do you remember that?" His face went ashen, and I could see the fear in his eyes. He knew that all his words, all his attempts to justify his importance, were meaningless now. He had no more to say. A heavy silence fell between us. He opened his mouth, trying to speak, but no words came out. He stood there, speechless, as everything he had built, the arrogance, the false sense of importance, crumbled in front of him. His role, his mask, everything vanished in that instant. He understood now that he could no longer control the situation. I was the one holding the power to determine his fate. But this was just the beginning. Each day at the hotel felt like a chess match where the moves of my opponents were predictable and their strategies were easily unraveled. They saw me only as the owner, someone who kept to the background, but their true natures, their deceit, their arrogance, were beginning to surface. From the moment I took control, I knew that patience would reveal everything. I started assigning them small tasks that seemed innocuous at first, adjusting schedules, taking on extra responsibilities, tweaking the structure here and there. But for me, these were tests. Each move was part of a carefully laid plan. I wanted to see just how far they would go to cling to their positions. It's remarkable how quickly those who once enjoyed stability begin to falter when their world shifts. Under such pressure, the true character of a person is exposed. Lies and arrogance always lead to their own downfall, and I was prepared to watch them destroy themselves. As the days passed and I introduced new challenges, I kept a close watch on their reactions. Initially, they were annoyed. Why should these changes affect them? But soon, I began noticing signs of panic. Some tried to cover up their mistakes. Others tried to hide their shortcomings, and a few resorted to throwing their colleagues under the bus. I sat in my office observing the tension growing among the team. For years, they had built their careers on deception and false confidence. But now, with the rules of the game altered, their old strategies were failing. One employee lied about completing a task, another deliberately sabotaged a colleague's work, and yet another tried to shift the blame. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between two employees. "I can't finish this on time, but if you help me, I'll make sure management knows it was all your achievement," one said, his voice full of hope. The other, smirking, replied, "You want me to do your work? No chance. I'll just tell them you screwed it up." That brief exchange was enough to tell me everything I needed to know. They were ready to betray each other for their own survival. This was when their masks began to fall, revealing their true selves. Later that day, I called everyone into the conference room. They didn't know why, but they could all feel the tension. I could see it in their eyes. Some exchanged nervous glances. Others tried to hide their unease. When the room was full, I stood at the front, letting the silence hang in the air. It was a heavy silence, filled with the weight of what was coming. Finally, I spoke. "Today, I want to talk about how your deceit has not only been ruining this hotel, but it's also been destroying you." My voice was calm but firm. "For the past few weeks, I've been watching you, and do you know what I've seen?" I paused for effect. "Lies. Lies you've told to each other, to yourselves, and to me. Each of you has built your career on deceiving someone, and today I'm here to show you where that has led." With that, I projected the evidence of their schemes onto a screen, emails, security footage, and documents where they had tried to cover their tracks. Their faces turned pale as they saw the proof of their lies, realizing there was no longer anywhere for them to hide. I paused the video and addressed them again. "Your lies have destroyed you. You thought you could hide behind your deceit, but now The truth is out in the open. Their faces were filled with despair as the realization hit them. They knew the game was over. This wasn't just an exposure of their lies. It was the crushing moment they saw their entire existence, built on deceit and manipulation, collapse. Every step I took within this hotel had been calculated, each one bringing me closer to my goal. Those who once looked down on me were now tangled in their own webs of deception, caught like insects in a trap. But I wasn't done yet. The lies and prejudices ran too deep in these people. It wasn't just a phase for them, but a way of life. I knew they needed more than just exposure. They had to face the full weight of their prejudices, not in some distant, abstract sense, but in the most personal way possible. I began to restructure the hotel slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Some employees lost their privileges, while others were given new opportunities. The new staff I hired was predominantly black. Individuals who had been overlooked by society now had the chance to lead those who had once considered themselves superior. Each day, I watched the old staff, so accustomed to their privileged positions, struggle against the new reality. They resisted, clinging to their former roles, but it soon became clear. It was futile. Their world was falling apart, and all they could do was accept it. I remember the day one of the former managers, the very same man who had once denied me a room, faced this new world. I walked into the lobby and saw him behind the reception desk, nervously shuffling papers, his face tense and his hands trembling. The man who had once held so much authority was now forced to perform the simplest tasks he had once considered beneath him. A family approached the desk, a mother, father, and their 2 children. They were black. As soon as the manager saw them, his face drained of color. It wasn't recognition, it was fear. He realized with a sinking heart that he now had to serve the people he had once dismissed, the people he had seen as inferior. His voice was weak and shaky as he greeted them. "Good afternoon," he said, his words faltering. The father politely responded, "We've booked a room for the week. We'd like to check in." The manager nodded awkwardly and began processing the check-in, his hands trembling over the keyboard, his face filled with defeat. I could see the weight of it. He was shuddering, humiliated by what was happening. The man who had once scorned me now had to humble himself before those he had once rejected. I watched quietly, not intervening. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I could see his prejudices breaking down, his pride being shattered by the undeniable force of reality. Once the check-in was complete and the family walked away, I approached him. He didn't even look at me. His gaze was fixed on the floor, as if he wished he could disappear. It was as though everything he had believed about himself and the world was disintegrating. "How does it feel?" I asked softly. He didn't answer immediately. I could see the weight of the situation pressing down on him, his shoulders slumping, his face pale as though all his strength had drained away. "It's just a job," he mumbled, trying to disguise the despair in his voice. But I wouldn't let him evade the truth. "You once denied me a room," I reminded him. "Today, you served those you looked down on. How does that feel?" Finally, he raised his eyes to meet mine. They were filled with fear and humiliation. It wasn't just fear of me, his new boss. It was the crushing realization of his own insignificance, the collapse of his entire belief system. He opened his mouth, but his voice faltered, unsure of what to say. He understood now that everything he had done, every belief he had held, had led him to this moment. And now, there was no way out except to accept it. I didn't say another word. I simply nodded and walked away, giving him the space to process what had just transpired. This wasn't the end, but it was a turning point. He had come to understand that the old ways would never return. I knew everything was shifting now, that the world these employees once knew was crumbling. They had faced their own trials, their false pride and prejudices slowly consuming them from within. But this wasn't just about exacting revenge. It was about cleansing. They needed more than just to acknowledge their mistakes. They needed to feel their world crumble beneath them. Today marked an important moment. I had decided to bring everyone together, the very people who had once looked down on me, who had thought themselves superior based on their own misguided beliefs. Now their status had changed. I offered them a final choice. They could leave with a severance package and put this chapter behind them, or they could stay and continue working, but under completely new rules. I knew many wouldn't be able to bear the pressure, but that didn't concern me. Those who chose to stay would have to undergo a full transformation. In that moment, my emotions were mixed. It wasn't about triumph or vengeance. It felt more like closure, like I was finally putting a chapter of my life to rest. Everything that had happened here was more than just a personal vendetta. It was a lesson I needed to impart, not just to them, but to myself as well. I stood before them in the conference room, looking at the faces of those who had once embodied discrimination and prejudice in this hotel. Their expressions were grim, most of them already realizing that their power had vanished. The control they once held had evaporated, and now everything depended on me. Today, you have a choice, I began, watching their reactions closely. You can leave with compensation and forget about this place, or you can stay, but under new rules. You'll have to accept the changes that have taken place here and work within the conditions I set. Some employees immediately dropped their gazes, nervously fiddling with papers. These were the ones who had already decided they couldn't survive in this new environment and planned to leave. Others, those with nothing left to lose, looked at me with a mix of uncertainty and reluctant understanding. They knew their options were limited. Those of you who choose to leave will receive generous compensation, I continued. But if you stay, everything will change. Your attitude, your work ethic, and your worldview will all have to adjust. One of the former managers, the same one who had once denied me a room, raised his hand. Fear and desperation were evident in his face. "What happens to us if we leave?" he asked, his voice trembling. I looked him straight in the eyes and answered calmly, "You'll start over. You'll have no privileges, but you'll have the opportunity to rethink your life." His face darkened as the weight of his situation sank in. He understood now that his former life, built on lies and arrogance, had come to an end, and he would need to confront a new reality. By the end of the day, some employees had already packed up and left. They couldn't handle the changes, unwilling to accept the new order. Those who stayed, however, were starting to adjust to a world where they no longer had the false sense of superiority they once enjoyed. I walked into the hotel lobby and saw the former manager standing near the exit. His shoulders were hunched, and he looked completely defeated. This was the same man who had once refused to serve me. He didn't even make an effort to acknowledge who I was now. As I stood beside him, I could see that he was fully aware of how much had shifted. I looked at him and said quietly, "You never bothered to find out who I was." He didn't reply. His face remained blank, but his eyes, those eyes, were vacant, filled with the realization that his whole life had been built on falsehoods. The confidence he once held had shattered. He simply nodded, still avoiding my gaze, and walked out. I watched him leave, understanding that this was bound to happen. I didn't feel anger or any sense of triumph. It was simply the conclusion of a story that had started with humiliation but ended in justice.